So this is a pretty random little video I wanted to do. This honestly all started because I personally have a hard time differentiating between Surrons and Talarias and E-Ride Pros and so on and so forth out in the wild. So I decided to just kind of bring up a picture of a Surron and a Talaria next to each other to kind of see what the differences are, to sort of get a better idea of how exactly they look different. And in the midst of trying to get a good idea of what their visual differences are, I started to actually notice different mechanical and structural differences between the two bikes. And it got me going down a rabbit hole of which bike is actually the better bike from like a structural mechanical engineering standpoint. Now, as a disclaimer, I am not a mechanical or structural engineer. I do not claim to be, but I think we've all built little spaghetti strand skyscrapers and bridges back in elementary school or whatever, or like, I'm sure most of us have enough experience with building with triangles and stuff, whether it be, back in elementary school or playing that bridge builder game on your phone or whatever. I think most of us all have a pretty good understanding of structural support and shapes like triangles and things like that. I think even without the relative background of being an actual mechanical or structural engineer, I think we can all kind of deduce what some of the better design choices are between these two bikes. And that's what the purpose of this video is. I just kind of want to talk about some of these differences and why I think that the Talaria Sting is in fact a superior bike mechanically and structurally speaking compared to the Surron Light B at least. So first things first, here are the two bikes. We've got the Surron Light B X here in black, and we've got the Talaria Sting MX4 here in black. And well, what do we see between the two bikes? What we see between the two bikes is that they both kind of have this very similar frame design where you have, like, let's look at the Surron, because the Talaria kind of builds off of the Surron. So I think starting with the Surron is probably the better way to go here. If you look at the design of the bike here, you have the frame, which is basically from the head tube here to this hinge or whatever you want to call that. So that's like the general shape of the frame. It's just like a straight line from there to there with this sort of like inner diamond sort of shape. Not really a diamond shape here so much as it is on the Talaria, but you see they both kind of have this, like, from hinge to head tube, it's like a straight line with this weird internal like diamond structure in the middle here that kind of just cradles the battery. It stops just on top of the motor and behind the motor here, and then you have a skid plate here in front. Same thing here for the Surron. It kind of stops here down behind the motor and as well as on top of the motor here, and then you have the skid plate covering this area here. And so that's the general shape of the frame itself. But the thing you will notice immediately between the Surron and the Talaria is that the Talaria actually builds off of this design, and I mean that quite literally. You have this original structure here with this sort of internal diamond shape here, but on top of that you have this additional structure on top. Well, let's actually start with this structure. You have this additional structure in the back here, which goes from the little hinge point of the swing arm up to basically like the meat of the seat or whatever. You have this extra support structure that actually goes up and meets the main portion of the seat that you're probably going to be sitting on here. So you actually have this direct support underneath the seat, which is really important. But then yeah, you also have this additional member here that attaches from like basically the top head tube area to this additional support, creating another additional triangle of structure here, right? So just in general, right off the bat, if we were just talking about the frame itself with nothing attached to it, not including the subframe or the swing arm or anything else, if we were just looking at the frame itself, the Talaria very obviously wins this fight. Like, obviously the Surron is the lighter bike, but the main reason the Talaria is the heavier bike is because it has a better frame. I mean, it has more support structure, and it has more support in important places than the Surron has. As you can see, the Surron, the seat is pretty much just hanging off the side of the frame here. If I'm looking at the Surron first glance and just sort of like thinking about what the design is, to me, it kind of looks like they had the frame more or less dialed. It seems like the frame was the first thing they made. They had that all good. They're like, man, we made a really good frame. But then they like kind of got like stuck. They're like, now what? Where do we go with the frame? Like, how do we attach a seat to this thing? And it makes the way this whole design plays out is it looks like they knew what they were doing with the frame, and then they got stuck and didn't quite know where to go from there. And then they just decided to sort of staple a seat onto the frame. That's kind of what it looks like to me. It looks like the frame and the battery cover and all that stuff is a complete afterthought to the existence of the frame. Like, they just sort of decided on a way to attach a seat to the frame without putting much thought into it. And so not only does it just kind of look odd because it kind of just looks like a secondary thought, not only does it look odd, but it seriously just doesn't actually have the same amount of support that the Talaria seat has. If you look here, it's really only actually supported by the bolts themselves, which just means that like any amount of pressure, whether it's back or forward pressure, you're putting pressure directly on these bolts, and it's just trying to leverage them and pull them away from the frame the entire time. So your seat is riding literally on whether or not these bolts decide to shear on you, right? If we go back to the Talaria, again, you'll notice the meat of the seat where you're likely to be sitting is actually directly supported by an actual support pillar here. I mean, obviously the seat's not really going to stay if you didn't have these bolts in place, but the fact that it actually has this, you know, downward support against the force of gravity and the weight of the rider or whatever, the Surron just doesn't have that, right? Like, even if you're sitting forward on the seat, the pressure is not really sitting on anything other than the bolts, you know what I mean? Whereas this, you actually have the subframe itself resting upon this support pillar of the frame, and then the bolt is just kind of making sure it doesn't leave that spot, more or less, right? Of course, if you're back seat on here, you're still gonna have the leverage sort of pulling these bolts up. You're never gonna get rid of that. But as far as like the neutral or forward position is concerned, you have additional support just by the fact that it is actually resting not only on this pillar here, but on this other additional support on the frame itself. So again, continuing with the frame being better, the subframe is better just because of its integration with the main frame. The Surron actually doesn't have any integration between the subframe and the main frame. They're literally just bolted together. They don't actually integrate like within each other. It's just like, oh, we threw some bolt holes on the side of the frame and then just attached the seat to it. Whereas this, it was like, kind of seems like Talaria, they saw what Surron did and they saw that they could do it better, and they had this vision and idea in their head from the beginning, and they just made that vision and that idea. They didn't like do this weird process where they're like, okay, we got the frame dialed, but now what, right? It seems like this was all a lot more intentionally designed as like one whole unit, you know what I mean? And so it all looks very integrated and nice compared to the Surron, where it kind of just looks like they tacked on some little bits and bobs here to the main frame that they created first, right? It kind of seems like it was a stepped process of creation, whereas this seems like it was all thought up and created at the same time as one integrated unit, right? And that shows with not only the seat, but like the battery cover too, which, like, sure, that is no longer structural at this point. This is just cosmetic, but the overall look of the bike is improved by just having this sort of more integrated look, where the battery cover sort of seamlessly integrates with the frame, and then somehow also seamlessly integrates into the subframe, which is also seamlessly integrated into the main frame. It's like this whole unit is just very seamlessly integrated. And visuals aside, just the way that the subframe itself is attached to the main frame is very clearly and obviously a superior method of attachment and is objectively more structurally sound. So the bike itself is just overall a more structurally sound design with the Talaria over the Surron. We'll move on down to the rear swing arm. Now, to be fair, the swing arm designs are pretty dang similar, I have to say. The Talaria swing arm might be better, it might not be, who knows. They're, again, very, very similar, but you do kind of have these sort of unnecessary angles, which kind of make me wonder about the overall structure compared to just having this straight line swing arm here with an additional triangular support on top. Like, this seems like, to me, it would be the better option because it's just one straight piece of metal and then a triangular support, whereas this has like a weird bend here and a weird bend here. It does have the triangular support, but it's sort of at like a different angle, and it's, I don't know. For all intents and purposes, let's just assume they're the same and kind of ignore the swing arm itself, because they're probably very similarly matched as far as actual mechanical structural performance is concerned. Although in my mind, I'm probably leaning towards the Talaria swing arm just because it's simpler, and usually the simpler design is the better one. It's just a triangle, right? It's like they just attached a triangle to the swing arm, whereas this, it was like they tried to do more than they had to. So the Occam's razor in me is leaning towards like the simple solution is probably the better solution. Could be wrong, they could be the same, the Surron could be stronger, but I think for the purpose of like rating these two bikes on structural soundness, I would just say they're equal. Let's call them equally matched. But looking at the attachment points here, and it's hard to say because this is just the head of a bolt, but it does look like a slightly more robust attachment point between the swing arm and the frame. And you can see here, it looks like it's pretty well reinforced as well. Like they have this additional circular bit of material here that just adds a bit of girth to that connection point. I don't think I really see that here. It kind of just seems like it's drilled out. We do have a little bit of a tab here, it looks like. Very hard to see in this picture, but you can see this frame is supposed to just continue straight, but there is this little bulge that pops out for the swing arm attachment point. But yeah, I would say that very possibly the attachment point for the swing arm is a little bit more robust on the Talaria. The one thing though that kind of has me leaning towards the Surron is this area specifically here down at the bottom of the frame where the pegs attach, which I'm not really sure how much that actually matters since it's south of the attachment point for the swing arm. So theoretically, anything on the frame below this doesn't really matter for anything other than the pegs. But it's hard to tell in this picture too, but this area here is arguably more robust on the Surron than it is here. But they're pretty damn close either way. And at the end of the day, I think it really is only structurally relevant to the pegs, honestly. So there might be a point towards Surron there, but you know, I'd have to really see them in person to fully compare that because they are pretty dang close. It might just be the shaping of the Surron frame down here that looks a little bit girthier, but it does look slightly girthier on the Surron, but I also could be wrong about that. But even more importantly, and this is getting a little bit away from the structural part and more into the actual mechanical part of the mechanical engineering aspect, but if we look at the way the shock attaches to the swing arm and to the frame itself, the suspension geometry is far superior on the Talaria. It just is. The way you want your suspension geometry to be is, for the most part, you want your suspension to be in line with the direction of travel, right? So if this wheel is moving up and down like this, that's pretty much where you want the shock to be. If your wheel's moving up and down like this, you want the shock to be moving up and down like this to an extent, right? What you don't want is for the shock to be, you know, laying down almost parallel with the swing arm. You're just not getting very good response from the shock itself with a geometry like that. And as you can see here, the swing arm is pretty much in line with the suspension, which is just not good because you have the wheel trying to move up and down this way, but the suspension is almost completely perpendicular to the actual movement of the wheel itself, which is sort of helped a little bit by the fact that you have this weird little angled platform here. So it does sort of change things a little bit, but overall, that's just not exactly how you want the rear shock to be set up. And the clearances here are pretty small too, so it's just not ideal, especially when it comes to trying to fit in aftermarket suspension. You know, like you have a lot less room to work with between the frame and the shock itself. So it's just overall not a very good design. It's just not. This is a lot closer to what you would want it to be. It's more in line with the direction of travel of the wheel itself and the suspension itself, and so it's just a better geometry for the suspension. It just is. And then of course, yeah, you have a mile of clearance here, so if you're trying to fit aftermarket shocks, fitment shouldn't be an issue because you have all this room here. But yeah, not really a whole lot to it. That was about all I really wanted to cover as far as the structure of the bike goes. Again, I was just kind of sitting here staring at the two bikes, and I started to realize what exactly made the Talaria a better frame than the Surron, because it really is. Like there's almost no way to deny it. I mean, if you want to talk looks or whatever, or design, like sure, you can like whichever bike you want to like, but if we're talking from a completely like structural mechanical engineering standpoint, the Talaria is very obviously the better bike from just an overall structural standpoint. I think they did a really good job at studying the Surron and trying to come up with a way to make it better. Like they really reinvented the wheel here is kind of what I'm saying. They saw what Surron did and they saw some things that they could make better and they just made them better. That's just kind of how it is. And I think honestly, Surron should probably change this design at the very least. Figure out their integration between subframe and the main part of the frame, because this is terrible right here. This is honestly terrible. Like the entire seat is just hanging off of bolts, whereas this seat is literally being supported. This seat is sitting on top of the frame. This seat is hanging off of the frame. It's pretty clear which one's a better design. You don't want your subframe hanging off of the main frame. You want your subframe like sitting on the main frame, right? It's obviously stronger to have it actually resting upon it than to have it hanging off the edge of it, right? Anyways, though, that's it for this video. Just wanted to do this. Subscribe for more. I might do some riding videos and stuff at some point, but this just so happened to be the first video I decided to make, so here it is. Peace out.